Welcome to this course on academic writing. So, in this class, we will look at why we need to focus on academic skills, academic writing skills, and also I will briefly outline the course contents, and then we will move on to define academic writing. We will look at its characteristics, comparing it with other forms of writing. So, this will help us understand several aspects which we will look at during the forthcoming lectures. So, in a survey, it was observed that writing skills are very important for success in higher education. However, the same survey also indicated that most students often lack these skills. Not just in academics, when students go out at workplace, then also these skills are very important for success. So, coming back to academic context, students are required to write assignments, reports, then they submit thesis, dissertations, term papers as part of their course. Also, international exams like IELTS, GRE and other things which students aspiring to study abroad take have a writing task. So, in all these contexts, usually students are expected to do two important things. One, they read, but they just do not read simply, they read critically, they analyze what they read so that it forms basis for their writing, and then when they write, they are expected to develop a coherent piece of text adopting a particular perspective, particular theoretical framework or a particular outlook after considering, exploring possible options. So, they just do not write, they write a coherent and a neatly structured text. So, the next question is, so in order to write so effectively, if a student has say adequate knowledge of language, that is grammar and vocabulary, is that enough? In fact, some people, when they say writing skills, they focus exclusively on these language aspects, but as we are going to see in the next lectures, these are just one of the prerequisite things. Writing beautifully, writing a good coherent text calls for actually synthesis of many skills, and that is what this course aims to focus on. So, some of the aspects which this course is going to cover are listed here. So, you can see from this list here. So, critical reading, then understanding and analyzing the task, gathering resources and using them, then basics of writing, structure of a paragraph, then various discourse strategies like narration, description, argumentative and cause effect, among others, and then some common forms of academic writing like thesis, research papers, reports, etc. And then we will also look at language aspects. So, you might be wondering why reading is here. As mentioned earlier, in order to write, you need to first read, gather resources, and then you start to write. So, these two aspects, you can say academic reading and writing, are going to be key focus areas in this course. I have listed some references, basic references here. Bailey 2004 Academic Writing, a practical guide for students. Then Giltrow et al. Academic Writing and Introduction, published in 2009. Gupta 2017, A Course in Academic Writing. Bonipalli and Pawar 2010, Academic Writing, a guide for management students and researchers. Reinking and Austin 2011, Strategies for Successful Writing. This is not an exhaustive list, but just an indicative one. There are also some web resources which you can use. Purdue Online Writing Lab, Massey University course on academic writing, How to Improve Your Academic Writing, developed by Essex University. This again is just a few selected resources. So, we move to the next section, that is defining the characteristics of academic writing. So, what it is and how it is different from other kinds of writing. So, if somebody asks you what exactly is academic writing, you can say that this is writing done in academic circles, mainly to communicate scientific knowledge. So, the audience here is people working in a particular field of study, maybe physics, chemistry, or English, any field of study. The most rigorous form of academic writing you are going to see in peer-reviewed international journals and some high quality doctoral dissertations. So, here researchers, after having done their research thoroughly, following a set of protocols, conventions, they share their findings with their colleagues, and the idea is the advancement of knowledge in that particular area of study. Not just journals, students write assignments, they do lots of reports in colleges and universities. So, these also are a kind of academic writing. In all these forms of academic writing, one important thing you will notice is that here ideas take center stage. People and their subjective opinions, their feelings, they are at the backstage, and sometimes they cannot be there at all. You will find instead here logical rigor. Whatever you say, it has lot of evidence. You cite previous studies to support it. So, that is, we can say it's logical rigor. Then language used is formal, technical vocabulary from the field is used, not just informal language, colloquial kind of language which you can usually find in spoken context or informal context. And then there are also some universally accepted conventions. So, you have conducted a research, say you have got some result, but how you present it, there again you have to follow some conventions. And again, each journal may have its own specific convention, but there are some generally accepted things. We are going to see these things in the following lectures. So, how is academic writing different from other kinds of writing? So, we have very briefly looked at the characteristics of academic writing, that it has logical rigor and formal language. So, these things become clear when we compare forms of academic writing with those we find in other contexts. For example, let us look at journalistic writing. So, journalistic writing means this includes what we find in newspapers and magazines. So, here you will find articles, news articles. These report a particular event. Sometimes they also comment on those events. Then you will also find columns. These are written by experts about current issues, and you can also include editorials here. They also throw light on current issues. We must note here that columns and editorials differ from the usual reports. While reports mostly answer who, what, when, where, how, these kinds of factual details are given by these reports. These columns and editorials also sometimes answer why. So, they include opinions, views expressed by the writer. Coming back to the target audience of these newspapers and magazines, it is obvious that they aim at a very wide range of people, because circulation is important, and as a result they look at a very wide audience for their newspapers and magazines. So, what are the characteristics of journalistic writing? These are, usually you can say that in journalistic writing, the style is crisp and attention grabbing, because people usually do not have a lot of time to go through these articles and read them in detail. Also, readers have a wide variety of options before them. So, these articles, their idea is you should make the reader get interested in a particular article very quickly, so that the reader does not move to other options or just simply does not leave it in the middle. So, they try to grab attention as quickly as possible and sustain it. So, we can say that they follow an audience centered approach. So, what does this include? So, one important feature is short essays and paragraphs. you can see that most of reports, they have very short sentences, and when there are multiple paragraphs, there are very short paragraphs, because it is easier for a reader to navigate, it is easier for a reader to understand things quickly. Most often you will also come across very catchy headlines. Let us look at some examples. Raju beats Obama on web popularity charts. This appeared in Indian Express. When insurance is bad for your health. This appeared in the New York Times. The scent of a man. This appeared in the Economist. So let's go back to the first one. So Raju beats Obama on web popularity charts. Here, immediately this kind of arouses curiosity among readers. One would want to know who this Raju is and how Raju fares better than Obama. The exclamatory mark at the end also indicates there is some very interesting story behind this. So, when a reader comes across this headline, he or she would want to look at the detailed article to find more details. Similarly, the second one, when insurance is bad for your health. Our common sense tells us that insurance is good for our health. By saying that it is bad, it again makes one wonder what the matter is. Similarly, the last one, the scent of a man. So, by just looking at it, is it going to be about some fashion, or is it going to be something about a research, what it is. So, I would want to go into the article and find out what the scent of a man this is talking about. Another important aspect is you will come across several instances of very creative uses of language in these newspapers and magazines. They use words which are already in use in a completely different sense. Sometimes they create their own words, they use slangs. For example, let us look at this two examples. If you look at the first one, so you can see here, born Chikawa, Kerching Chika Ching. This appears in an article in the Economist, and the context here is talking about perfume users. So, immediately somebody would want to know what these words mean. Are these from English or from other languages? If you do a bit of search, then you will find that these are words from urban slang. Let us look at another example. This is from an article which appeared in the New York Times, and the article was on why onions make us cry. Look at the language here. Unfortunately, it seems there is no simple way to avoid it. For the love of onions, sometimes you just have to cry. The pronoun you is used, it means it is highly personalized. The writer is addressing the audience directly, and though it is probably going to talk about some science behind why onions make us cry, the language here is very colloquial, and it appeals to a wide variety of audience. Each newspaper has its own code, their own conventions, how a particular word is written or how punctuation marks are used, for example. And there are some general conventions as well. Um, so, but these are not as rigid as in academics. So, recall here we mentioned in the very beginning that there are some conventions academic writers have to follow. Magazines and newspapers, in that context also people follow some conventions, but they are not as rigid as in academics. Moving on, we now look at creative writing. So, this category includes novels, short stories, poetry, plays, and so on. Here we get to see writers' subjective interpretation of reality. This reality is not portrayed as it is, it goes through writer's perception. Sometimes you will find that whatever is presented is completely imaginary. This is a pure imagination, this work of imagination. This we call artistic license. For example, if you read Harry Potter series, we definitely know that flying brooms do not exist, or a magic wand, for example. However, artists have this freedom to imagine things and present them in their own creative ways. Creative writing sometimes can be based on facts, actual events. For example, there are historical novels, but it need not always be factual. As we have noted, it can be a pure work of imagination. When you come across such imaginary things, nobody expects to find any evidence or proof. Whenever writers come to some conclusion, they are not expected to furnish any evidence for it. This is in complete contrast with what happens in academic writing. So, you reach a conclusion, your audience definitely expects you to provide solid evidence. You have to give undisputable evidence to show that on the basis of that you have reached this particular conclusion. In creative writing, readers enjoy a piece of literary work or do not. So, the word here is enjoy. So, here nobody questions the validity or the credibility. In contrast, again, an academic piece of writing, you question its validity and you want to be sure that it is trustworthy. One can here recollect what Samuel Taylor Coleridge has said, that is willing suspension of disbelief. This is what we do when we approach a creative piece of writing, but academic context we do not do so, we cannot afford to do so. Creative writing has a lot of passion, lot of wit, and as the name itself says, there is a lot of creativity in it. There are of course some conventions, like for example we call genre convention. So a novel needs to have a plot, needs to have a protagonist and an antagonist and so on. A poem, so poem has to be in this particular fashion. So there are some conventions. However, these are being redefined these days, and creative writers always they defy these limits and boundaries. Each creative writer has his or her own distinctive style, and this is what makes them popular or not so popular. Coming to language use, we know that writers manipulate language in very creative ways. For example, this is a line from Robert Burns' poem, "My love is like a red, red rose." You try typing two words, the same words twice on a computer, immediately a red line appears because this is grammatically not appropriate. But in literary context, this is accepted. This is a creative use of language. Another example, the poet E. Cummings. If you look at his name, he chose not to use capital letters at all. But again, the rules tell you that the proper name, the first letter has to be capital, and also your initials should be in capital, but he chose not to use them. Another thing, writers have always been known to invent new words, create new words to express their ideas and feelings. For example, Shakespeare created the word bedazzled in his play The Taming of the Shrew. Of course, the word has got a new sense now, but it did not exist before Shakespeare used it in this particular context. Nerd is quite a well-known word these days. However, it didn't exist before. This was first created by Dr. Seuss in his book for children, which was called If I Ran the Zoo. So, you will come across many such instances when you are reading a creative work. The question now is, can you create a new word in a similar fashion or use an already existing word in a completely new sense in academic context? Answer is yes, but your approach will be different. So, if you create a word, you have to justify why you are doing it. You need to provide theoretical background and rationale for doing so. But a creative writer does not need to. He or she just uses it, and then it may also become part of everyday language. But academic context, as I have already mentioned, the approach is different, and most often such words are restricted to one particular field of study. Now we come to third important kind of writing we often see. This is writing in interpersonal contexts. So, what comes under this? Usually personal emails. Earlier we used to write letters, but these days not often. Then there are diary entries, then blogs, and then these days we have social media posts. So, what is the aim here? The aim here is to communicate your personal feelings, thoughts, or ideas. So, the key word here is personal. It includes your view about something, your opinion about something or about somebody. So, personal judgments. Then it could also be reflection on what you've done recently. So, this can follow a loose structure. There are no rigid conventions. For example, you are posting something on a social media. You can structure it to reflect your feelings, emotions. You need not follow how a paragraph is written, as we would do in an academic context. Also, you do not need to strictly adhere to rules of language like grammar, vocabulary, or punctuation. You can use incomplete sentences, you can use your own abbreviations, short forms, you can use slang, and also sometimes there is mutually agreed upon code, say between two close friends or within a friend circle. So, this part of the gang, you can use even that kind of language. These things you will definitely not see in academic context. So, we have looked at journalistic writing, creative writing, and interpersonal context. So, comparing academic writing with these three, it is clear that academic writing is more formal, it has a clear structure, and then there are some conventions to follow. Now, let us compare two texts to understand these differences in a much better way. Both the texts are on the same topic, that is why onions make us cry. Let us look at these texts. So, this is version 1. Inside the intact cells of an onion, a molecule called sulfonic acid precursor floats around the watery filler like a napping human in a lazy river. Also floating in that cytoplasm are little sacs called vacuoles containing a protein called alliinase, which is like a little drill sergeant of the process. One has not seen the other, but if you damage the cells, they can now meet and make these reactions, said Marcin Golczak, a biochemist at Case Western Reserve and principal investigator of the latest study. The molecule and the protein fit together perfectly. The chemical structure of the molecules change, and that lazy floater becomes a smelly soldier armed with tear gas. In this text, we are going to look at where this is from a little later. If we analyze this, I have italicized certain sections. Say for example, in the second line, like a napping human in a lazy river. Then end of the first paragraph, like a little drill sergeant of the process. Then this quote from the scientist, one has not seen the other, but if you damage the cells, they can now meet and make these reactions. Then somewhere towards the end, there is this adverb perfectly. Then towards the end of this second paragraph, lazy floater becomes a smelly soldier armed with tear gas. So, do you observe something about the parts I have highlighted? Here you can see that language is very informal, very colloquial, and comparisons are used to explain a scientific process. So, for example, napping human in a lazy river, and then little like a little drill sergeant, and then again towards the end, lazy floater becomes a smelly soldier. So, the chemicals are compared with something more concrete which people can easily associate with. Also, look at this quote. This is again very informal. So, one has not seen the other, you are kind of personifying the chemicals, and then there is the adverb perfectly. So, it means there is no scope for any limitation there, anything. So, these characteristics clearly show that this is kind of written in a more informal way. The audience is general public, and also look at the technical words, how many technical words have been used, and so on. Now, we will look at the second version. This is also about the same topic, that is why onions make us cry. So, this is version 2. In 1961, the Finnish biochemist Arturi Virtanen showed that onions contain trans plus S propenyl L cysteine sulfoxide, a positional isomer of allene. See bottom illustration on page 115. That is, its chemical content is identical with that of allene, only its structure differs. Specifically, it differs in the position of a double bond, which, as the one in its name indicates, is attached directly to sulfur. Trans plus S 1 propenyl lysine sulfoxide is the lacrimatory precursor, or LP. The onion's allinase enzyme converts it into the lacrimatory factor, or LF, the substance that makes people cry when they slice an onion. You will immediately notice that this text is very different from the first one. So, what are the differences? So, in this text, as you might have observed, there are many technical terms and also some specific conventions, how something is referred to, how something is described. I am going to show you a comparison between these two texts, and then we will come back to the question, which one is academic. So, the first one, you might have observed that it has informal and colloquial language. The second one has more formal language. The first one we saw that has examples and comparisons, similes used to make something understand, whereas the second one did not have any such thing. The first one had technical terms, of course, but the second one had a lot of technical terms. In the first one, the focus, you can identify that, is on conveying the gist, the main idea, whereas the second one includes a lot of details. So, it just not talks about what, it also gives details about on how or even why. So, as mentioned earlier, the first one uses many similes, comparisons, whereas you will not find any such thing in the second one. The first one has no conventions. I am going back. So, you can see here this is a plain text, except that there is a quote and it is in inverted commas, whereas if you look at the second one, you will see here lots of academic conventions being followed. For example, how you refer to illustration, which comes sometime later, or you are giving additional details about something. So, how this is presented, and also how you refer to people and the year, all these conventions, these are very clear in the second text. Note here that both of them talk about why onions make us cry. So, by now it must have been very clear to you that the second text, is from academic context, whereas the first text is from a different context. So, what are these? Let us look at the sources. The first one you saw is from the New York Times, whereas the second one is from a journal called Scientific American. So, you can note here that the article from the New York Times talks about a scientific process, just like this article from the journal does, but the approach is very different. So, one has many technical terms, the other uses as few as possible. The one focuses more on details, specific technical specific details, whereas the second one includes only as little as possible. It is precisely because the target audience is different. A newspaper article, as we noted earlier, is for a wider audience. People from different walks of life read it. Therefore, the article must be easily comprehensible. Therefore, the focus is on conveying the gist and using as few technical words as possible, whereas the journal article is written for a specific audience. Here, people from chemistry. So, therefore, few things are here taken for granted. For example, the technical terms and how they are written or how certain things are referred to are part of the convention, and the writer assumes the readers know about it. Therefore, the writer does not explain these things in detail. However, a newspaper article cannot take things for granted. You have to explain in as simple terms as possible to reach people. So, now you know that the clear difference between a journalistic piece of writing and an academic piece of work. So, on the basis of this little exercise, we can understand features of academic writing in a better way. Some are listed here. One is a clear and linear structure. We have noted earlier, say in for example, your social media posts or your personal emails or diary entries, they need not have a clear and a very well built organization, but an academic piece of work has it. For example, you look at a research paper, we can usually find the following sections in a research paper. Of course, depending on the field of study and the nature of the study, there may be slight variations, but you will usually find the following things in a research paper. There is first introduction to the field, very little introduction, because note here many things are taken for granted, and introduction to the specific subfield of inquiry. Then there is review of previous research. You want to show here that you have read all the main, at least the main important works, and you are drawing on them, and then on the basis of that you identify a gap and you articulate your research questions or hypotheses, and then you talk about your research methodology, what you are going to do, what how you are going to collect data and so on. And then we will talk about your data collection procedures and your analysis. Then the results, and there is a discussion on data analysis and findings. Then there is conclusion. You will also find references. Endnotes and appendices are usually optional. So here I must draw your attention to this point about references. A newspaper article, for example, I am going back to this. This is also well researched and written on the basis of a particular study, but a newspaper article is very unlikely to have a list of references. However, a journal article in an academic context like this one does have a long list of references. The same is true in case of an assignment submitted by a student, or your master thesis, doctoral dissertations. All these have section called references. So there is a clear structure for your research paper. Even if you are writing, say, a short essay, that also has a clear structure in academic context. So any essay, usually we can identify three broad sections: introduction, So, here you introduce the topic or you make your position clear on a particular issue, and then comes body where you present your arguments or you give details or you classify things depending on the nature of the assignment, and then you have conclusion where you kind of summarize whatever you have said so far and make your position again very clear. So, even an essay has a clear structure in academic context. So, for the essay also you are expected to cite the sources, then list them under references. So, conventions you have to follow. Clarity is another important aspect of academic writing. So, whatever you say, you have to say it very clearly using clear sentences and most appropriate vocabulary. There is no scope for ambiguity here. It is your academic paper cannot be open to multiple interpretations. Note here that a literary work you can interpret it in multiple ways depending on the framework and other things. However, your academic paper you should not be able to do it because clarity is an important aspect. A cohesive and a coherent argument backed up with evidence. This is what you will find in an academic context. So, shorter essays have a clear argument, you take a position, you build it. Your research papers, again the same thing, your dissertations, your thesis, they also put forth a clear argument on a particular topic. You either dispute previous things or you present something in support of it, or you are going to kind of balance both the old and the new. So, when we say evidence, what we mean here in academic context is, there are some facts which are well established, then there are details from previous studies which are trustworthy. So, that is important. So, you cannot depend on previous studies which are not very credible. So, the research methodology might be a flawed one or there may be other issues. So, in academic context such studies are not referred to. You depend on trustworthy sources, and then you also bank on findings of experts. So, experts means these people have worked extensively and have published. So, all these come under evidence in academic context. So, to sum up, academic writing builds on evidence. There is no scope for personal opinions there. It has a clear structure and language is very formal, and there is no scope for creative use of language in academic context. Looking at some more features, so coming to the language, things are understated, you adopt a very cautious tone here. We will look at it in detail in the lectures in the due course. As I mentioned, you do not use any creative, you do not creatively use language, you adhere to conventions strictly, then you have to adhere to rules of punctuation and grammar, and of course meticulous citation and referencing is another key feature of academic writing. We will explore these aspects in detail in the following lectures. Thank you.